Hi, I'm Madeline James, and this is the next cultural world building guide video where we will be going over a global classical antiquity map and discussing hunter-gatherers, subsistence-based bands, and the origins of the early states, state building if you will, where and how they form, and the requirements for one of these states to form. This video builds off the earlier videos in this series and my global world building guide, so as long as you have the equivalent maps, you should be good. And this guide will go over a lot of foundational topics that, while not directly relevant to just drawing the map, will subvert a lot of misconceptions and provide what is, in my opinion, some pretty foundational knowledge on state building for world builders. And as always, there will be chapters in this video, so you can skip around as desired, and a blog post version linked in the description below. And yes, I am going to use a lot of graphics of antiquity maps because they are very pretty and fit the theme. So our main goal with this series is to world build societies and cultures, which are undeniably complex and arise from long, unique histories. This next step is to build out what our worlds may have looked like near the beginning of what we call the Age of Antiquity, also known the Ancient Times or the Classical Era, all the way up to the end of this sort of era being about 450 Common Era on Earth, so 3000 BCE to 450 CE on Earth. And this begins with the first primary states, so those that arose independently of other pre-existing states, forming alongside a golden age of barbarians. And by this age, humans had evolved enough to have what we would consider a modern mind, so thinking the same way we did, or having the capabilities that we have now from a brain perspective. And we will be covering both early state people and non-state people, otherwise known as barbarians. And before our regular disclaimer, I wanted to provide a few updates and some new resources. So I'm going to start updating the blog versions of these guides, and this is both guide series, to fix various issues, and I will be linking to a page on my website for each video that won't be linkable anywhere else on my website, that will basically explain what has changed and been updated from when I filmed the video, and where it makes sense, I will add corrections to these videos as well, but I will be updating the blog as I make these changes, so the most up-to-date stuff will be the blog, and if you want to watch the videos, you can go and see what's changed pretty quickly and easily. It's going to take me a little while to put all this together, so hang with me, but I'm glad to be starting to implement this because it is a long time coming. But now the big thing. So throughout this guide, I have been trying to find sources and articles that avoid the harmful sides of geographic determinism. We've talked about this a lot. And show a more geographic possibilist approach and use a lot more of the well thought of research. And I was lucky enough to get in contact with a geographer that goes by Ross Bay Geo here on YouTube, and you may recognize him from a lot of his recent work with Artifexian if you've watched any of his recent videos, which have been awesome, by the way. But Ross does a lot of work with historical, cultural, and political geography, intersecting with colonialism, conflict, and various infrastructures. And the dissertation he is working on has a lot of overlap with the topics I'm using for this guide, and he has graciously offered to help me find some good resources, share his thoughts, and provide some early feedback for me in this series. So some of the books and resources that I have been working with are pretty good, but others have been less so. And I was definitely going in the wrong direction with this guide in a couple of ways. So I'm really glad that I consulted with him when I did. And I've taken a good bit of time to go through all of this stuff, rethink my approaches. And Ross has recommended some books for me that have really, really helped. And I'm working through them to make this guide as accurate and helpful as I can. Here are 6 of these main books that I've started with. So we have Against the Grain, A Deep History of the Earliest States by James C. Scott. The Ancient Hawaiian State, Origins of a Political Society by Robert J. Hammond. The Creation of Inequality, How Our Prehistoric Ancestors Set the Stage for Monarchy, Slavery, and Empire by Kent Flannery and Joyce Marcus. The Decline and Rise of Democracy, A Global History from Antiquity to Today by David Stasevich. Why Men by Nancy Lindisfarne and Jonathan Neal, and The Patriarchs, The Origins of Inequality by Angela Saini. And the main books that I'm pulling on for this part in the guide in particular is against the grain and the creation of inequality. So let's start with what is a state, right? So we typically see a state defined as the end state of political organization advancement, the start of civilization where a group has evolved past bands, tribes, and chiefdoms. And this is a fundamentally flawed and simplistic way of looking at states, as we will dive into more shortly. In order to create realistic societies and cultures for our fictional worlds, we must face the truths of what states were and what they were not. If you want to be cynical, you could say the beginning of state building was also the beginning of the domestication of people themselves. So the first primary states formed thousands of years ago, but it wasn't until relatively recently, perhaps 1600 CE, that the vast majority of the population were state people. Through most of the timelines we will be building through, non-state people will likely encompass a large portion of our maps. Although note that feudal polities, like much of medieval Europe and Japanese kingdoms, were not actually states. States will mostly be confined to areas that can support a densely populated civilization and retain control over said people, and everywhere else, the hinterland, will belong to non-state groups. So, there is no single agreed upon definition for a state, but they contain a lot of similar ideas. For our purposes, we will be looking at what James C. Scott said on defining a state in Against the Grain. I am inclined to see stateness as a more or less proposition rather than strictly either or. There are many plausible attributes to stateness, and the more of them a particular polity possesses, the more likely we are to call it a state. We think of states as institutions that have strata of officials specialized in the assessment and collection of taxes, whether in grain, labor, or specie, and who are responsible to a ruler or rulers. We think of states as exercising executive power in a fairly complex, stratified, hierarchical society with an appreciable division of labor: weavers, artisans, priests, metalworkers, clerks, soldiers, cultivators. Some would apply more stringent criteria. A state should have an army, defensible walls, a monumental ritual center or palace, and perhaps a king or queen. From 118 Scott. There are a few hallmarks of early states or civilizations, although not all of these traits were exclusive to states, and they were almost exclusively agrarian, which means they relied on agriculture for much of their subsistence. And they had multiple tiers of social hierarchy, had some form of social inequality where those in charge had the most power, and typically had hereditary rank, meaning social status and roles could be inherited. The first ancient primary states, the cradles of civilization as they are frequently called, arose in 6 world regions between 2,000 and 6,000 years ago, roughly. Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, China, Mesoamerica, and Andean South America. There were also primary states that formed in the Polynesian, Tongan, and Hawaiian Islands, as established in the ancient Hawaiian state, and perhaps in other areas, but this was later than the time that we are currently going to be looking at. Crop domestication and sedentism, not only 4 states. When we think of the first states, we imagine the beginnings of agriculture and the first cities, but this isn't actually the case. It is important to be aware that while agriculture, the domestication of crops, and building sedentary settlements are all hallmarks of states and civilization, these things came well before the first states, about 4,000 years before. Humans began influencing and changing the world around them to suit their needs a very long time ago. We used fire to shape land to easily grow the plants we wanted to eat. Foragers selected for features in plants that made them easier for us to gather. We began domesticating the first animal, dogs, 10,000 years before the first state, if not much sooner. And many other domesticates like cows, sheep, and goats, maybe 6,000 years before the first state. Sedentism was very commonly seen in areas that were ecologically rich, such as wetlands, and areas on the border of seasonal migration paths of game. These were places that had a large variety of subsistence food options for people, meaning there was no real motivation for them to move around. Please also note that sedentism should not be considered a stage that a group progressed to. Few groups were exclusively sedentary or nomadic in early history. They were very flexible and adapted to what the climate, environment, and other factors required to provide the easiest and most stable lives. Some groups were partially sedentary, staying in one place for harvesting and then moving on to another area. In areas with more than enough food and variety to sustain them, subsistence groups usually became more sedentary. When these areas dried up or otherwise became less productive, groups would then become more migratory or nomadic again. So going forward, remember that non-state people had domesticated animals, agriculture, settled villages, and in some cases even cities. Further, they were the ones that developed many of the harvesting and production tools used by the first agrarian states. Their knowledge of the natural world was broad and advanced. So, let's talk about subsistence barbarians. Subsistence groups are those that gather or produce just enough food to feed themselves and their families. They don't have to produce extra to pay taxes or support non-farmers. These groups are referred to by a lot of names: hunter-gatherers, foragers, subsistence bands, barbarians, savages, etc. But these are basically our non-state people, and I will be using some of these names interchangeably. Subsistence groups can be sedentary, migratory, nomadic, a combination of these, or they can move fluidly between them as needed. Some lived in villages or even small cities, while others built mobile homes that could easily be taken with them. These groups are not confined to a single or even a couple main subsistence types. They are not just herders or hunters or horticulturalists or shifting agriculturalists. They likely take advantage of most, if not all, kinds of subsistence available in their environment. Attempts to divide these people into specific subgroups like nomadic herders or fishing bands, etc., can be inaccurate and ignores the true complexity of these groups. They weren't limited to these individual subsistence options like this. So because of their varied diets and subsistence options, subsistence groups were extremely adaptable and flexible, able to adjust to climate change and the loss of food sources in ways that early states were unable to do. Many groups had food preservation and storage technology, especially those that did most of their hunting while migratory animals came by, but starvation was still a worry. A hard winter could be devastating. Still, they had a varied diet, meaning they were well nourished when food wasn't scarce. Sometimes that is something that is clearly evident when looking at their remains compared to state people of the same time. They had lower mortality rates, we will get into that more later, longer lifespans, and were even taller due to the better nutrition. Further, subsistence groups spent less time acquiring food than state people, and the activities were generally less strenuous. They weren't a people exclusively occupied by feeding themselves. They usually spent a great deal of time with other chores like cooking, making clothes and tools, ritualistic or spiritual events like feasts and dancing, and so on. Being less crowded also meant they didn't have the crowding diseases of civilizations that ran rampant through early states, although they did have their own diseases that they were susceptible to. Life for hunter-gatherers was not particularly safe. The chance of injury and death from hunting or warfare between groups was notable, although still didn't decrease their life expectancy below that of states people. We just shouldn't ignore it. And we may not be able to argue that life as a hunter-gatherer was significantly better than that of the early states people, but it would not be hard to say that their lives were at least as good. They both had their benefits and challenges, but life in the early state was not superior. So let's go through an overview of early states people. So the densely populated agrarian people of early states required a far higher yield from their land than subsistence groups needed. This level of production, especially given non-modern technology, was extremely time-consuming and arduous. The risk of repetitive stress injuries rose dramatically due to the repetitive labor that was required, and the only areas perhaps exempt would be recessional agriculture, so farming on a floodplain, where less work would be required for the same yield. And the power of a state was essentially a numbers game. They needed productive land to cultivate and farmers to work it. But most early states were dependent on grain crops, and we will get into why later, which was a large impact when encompassing a large part of people's diets. Having a very limited diet, especially if most of it is grains, which do not have a lot of the nutrients we need, leads to malnourishment. This further leads to more susceptibility and worse survival rates of sicknesses. On the plus side, grains provided soft foods to wean children earlier, and high-carb diets led to women ovulating more frequently, going through puberty sooner, and through menopause later. Combined with the incentives of having more children to add to the family's labor force, these farmers had children at a much higher rate than hunter-gatherers. And despite higher mortality rates, this resulted in a slight demographic advantage that over time became quite significant, and as we mentioned before, the power and success of states was a numbers game. This typically led to the most important role for women being producing more workers for the state. So the density of people, animals, and plants led to the development of crowding diseases, as we mentioned, which then led to epidemics affecting all three groups. Diseases could decimate crop yields, kill off large numbers of animals, and decimate populations. While hunter-gatherers had their own diseases to contend with, they didn't follow the same contagious patterns of epidemics. For people, these types of diseases like cholera, smallpox, measles, etc. were the major overall cause of human mortality until very recently. This, combined with the poor nutrition of early farmers, meant that life expectancy was lower. As detailed in Against the Grain, farmers in early states were on average 4 inches shorter than hunter-gatherers at the same time and displayed signs of nutritional distress and iron deficiency anemia, especially in women of childbearing age. Early states had 40 to 50% higher mortality rates than hunter-gatherers, the worst being infant and maternal mortality. So early states were very fragile and prone to breaking apart and reforming repeatedly through history due to a variety of reasons, including drought, climate change, livestock and crop disease, epidemics, upstream deforestation leading to salinization and increased floods, and warfare. Early states saw frequent fighting over the small areas conducive to high-density settlements and warfare for the purpose of taking slaves to expand their populations. Note that not state groups also saw plenty of warfare. The harshness of life for non-elites through taxation and various forms of coercion and slavery also led to uprisings, revolts, and the people fleeing to the hinterlands for a better life. All of these factors meant that early states were far from stable. I think it is also worth noting real quick that there are societies that fit somewhere between truly subsistence groups and actual states. A group could, for example, produce and store a surplus of food but not actually be considered a state due to a lack of centralized government or sufficient stratification, for example. One example of this would be feudal societies that were not actually typically states, such as feudal Japan. You can have a polity, a society with an organized government and identity that is not a state. Remember that. So, there are many explanations for why states formed. There were certainly benefits, but some go as far as to argue that it is a natural application of human nature. The creation of inequality thoroughly explores the growth and development of various stages of social organization and provides a foundation for why these changes occur. They establish the natural tendency of animals to develop hierarchies, which serves as the basis for inequality in state building, going back to how chimpanzees have strong degrees of social inequality and a dominance hierarchy. The creation of inequality also attributes the strengths of Homo sapiens in social networking and the building of alliances, something that can be seen across many early foraging groups. A common explanation for the increases in coercion and inequality that come with more complex societal structures is the hard times hypothesis. This theory states that when a group experiences difficulty, such as overpopulation, starvation, natural disasters, there follows an escalation of coercive measures to control the population and an increase in the authority of the leaders to impose such measures. This is explored further in both the creation of inequality and Against the Grain. These early kingdoms did not historically arise from the slow growth of individual chiefdoms. They were forged in blood and warfare. The transition from chiefdoms to kingdoms typically occurred over generations as aggressive leaders conquered neighboring chiefdoms, eventually forming kingdoms. The same later applies to empires, which were the result of kingdoms taking over other kingdoms. Once you have a kingdom, this encourages the creation of other kingdoms in the area out of necessity. These secondary kingdoms could be chiefdoms joining together to defend themselves, joining together to usurp the initial kingdom, or just the result of chiefdoms emulating their neighbors. The creation of inequality explores the formation of a number of kingdoms, comparing this process if you would like to look more into this. So we've discussed the fragility of early states. The first generation of kingdoms and empires will eventually dissolve and a new generation will form. Each consecutive generation will build off the previous one's traditions, strategies, and institutions. And while the first generations around the world tend to be very similar, there seem to be few ways initial kingdoms can form, Once they exist, later generations become more and more diverse. So agriculture, coercion, taxation, and a centralized government. Non-state groups, especially those that were settled, frequently came to practice some form of agriculture. These crops, what might eventually become the staples for states, could store well for use in winter and when other food sources were less available. They were a safety net. So as groups became more sedentary, they would have fewer available food sources in their range, which meant becoming more dependent on those in their immediate surroundings and those that they cultivated themselves. Over time, climate change, population growth, and other factors could lead them to being even more dependent on agriculture. This is sometimes referred to as the agricultural trap, forcing an endless cycle of leaning harder into agriculture and thus becoming more dependent on it. As settlements grew and eventually turned into states, increasing agricultural yields became more and more time-consuming and arduous. The life of an early state farmer was full of this drudgery. It took new effort to manage large-scale agricultural building efforts like irrigation and to maintain peace as the population rose. In order for the elite or rulers to sustain a state, they needed enough food to support non-farmers, specifically themselves, the managers, their armies, their laborers, etc., and they needed farmers to produce that surplus. The strength and success of a state, as we've said, is a numbers game. The more citizens, the more farmers, the more food, the more wealth, the more power. As explored in Against the Grain, people won't choose on their own to work harder to produce a surplus that they don't need. They must be coerced. And the harder you force people to work and the more you control them or overthrow the elites and get rid of the state for a while, or take their place, the harder it's going to be, creating a need for a game of balance. It was suggested that it was unlikely to have states form anywhere people were not trapped by desert, mountains, or other dangers beyond the border. So controlling their population and keeping them within the state is one of the most important tasks for the elites of a state. Propaganda and the building of walls are an important part of this, but some form of coercion is required. They must coerce people to stay within the state, to produce a surplus to support non-farmers, and to produce more people at as fast a rate as possible. The non-elites in these early states, and most states throughout history, were not free. Debt slavery was particularly common. So, the main ways the elite or rulers can support themselves and other non-farmers is through taxation, mainly taxable crops and corvée labor. Corvée labor is a type of taxation where citizens are required to provide unpaid labor for public works, and was used to some extent in many earlier states, especially those that did not have good taxable crops, such as with the Incans and other early Andean states. In our history, the primary states of antiquity were all based on taxable grain crops, although that isn't a hard and fast rule for fictional worlds. Grains, namely rice, wheat, barley, and maize, are particularly suited for dense populations, tax assessments, surveys, storage, and rationing. In order to have an ideal crop for taxation, you need something that can be productive enough to support large populations, be surveyable by signaling ripeness above ground, have a predictable harvest for tax collection, be easy to store, transport, and ration back out. Rice is the best for this purpose, with other primary grain crops of the early states following close behind. Though through the evolution caused by the cultivation of foragers, other crops could theoretically have evolved into suitable crops for taxation, such as quinoa, legumes, nuts, etc., although some crops would have been the least suitable, like tubers, which grow underground and do not need to be harvested right away, instead being fine to stay underground until needed. A suitable system of taxation, whichever method you go with, is an important requirement for states. Another condition of the early state was a centralized government, which meant the speed of communication and travel was critical. If your armies can't reach an area, you can't maintain control. Trade was also very important for a civilization to get all the resources it needed. For this reason, states needed navigable rivers or coastal waters nearby. Rivers were also a good source of fresh water and useful for irrigation. So now let's talk about the actual prevalence of states and their non-state twins, sometimes referred to in books as the dark twin of civilization. So another misconception I've come across is this idea that once states begin forming, they will inevitably expand across the world, replacing non-state subsistence groups as they go. I found it surprising to learn that for most of history, since the first states formed, states were the minority. It was only 400 years ago that a third of Earth was still populated by non-state peoples. And keep in mind that, again, state peoples were significantly densely populated, so the non-state peoples were much more spread out, meaning the portion of the surface area of landmass that they controlled was significantly higher. Due to the combination of the fragility of early states and the restrictive conditions that they can manage to thrive in, much more of our fictional worlds may be populated by non-state people than we might expect. The relationship between states and non-state groups was also more complicated and intertwined than many would assume. States did not have military advantage over more mobile groups, not until maybe the gunpowder age was well underway. These non-state groups might raid their settled neighbors for easy food and resources, may demand tribute to not raid, may sell their services as mercenaries, or may act as traders between states and the world outside their lands. States were also fairly reliant on resources not found inside their borders, leaving a ripe opening for nomadic pastoral groups in particular to take advantage of. Once larger-scale trade networks grew, these groups evolved and adapted to control and capitalize on it. So as trade grew around the world, we saw these groups form as pairs: civilized agrarian states and barbarian nomadic pastoral traders. These relationships were volatile and varied. Some examples include the Jin dynasty and the Mongols, Caesar's Roman Republic and the Gaelic, Germanic, and Brittonic tribes, the Qing dynasty and the Ottomans, the Turkish Khaganate and the Tang, the Egyptians and the Sea People, and the city-states of Mesopotamia and the Amorites. Understanding these relationships for the benefits and the conflicts that they created provides a lot of potential for world-building societies and their histories with one another. So this leaves us with a rough list of conditions for the forming of early states, although not all early states would have to meet these, as long as the basic needs were met by some other aspect of world building. And again, this is where we get to create interesting states. Go off the list, think about the benefits that they provide, and come up with a few interesting conditions yourself. So, taxable grain crop that could be grown efficiently in the given environment, or other form of taxation like corvée labor, meaning rich silt and plenty of water. Alluvium was the best. Time of plenty, where population relied on a particular form of subsistence and then had their commitment reinforced in more difficult times, where there are fewer alternative subsistence options, the agricultural trap. Geographic or political borders that prevent the easy escape of the population, or they could build walls. Easily navigable waterways, such as rivers or coastlines. Sufficiently authoritarian leadership as to control and confine the population. Leaders chosen by or associated with the spiritual, likely as hereditary rulers tied to a powerful ancestor, the spiritual, or gods. High enough population growth as to offset the fragility and high mortality of early states, such as through a primarily grain diet and encouragement of reproducing. Founding hardships triggering the rise of coercion and social stratification, the hardship principle. And not required but also likely found is a twin non-state nomadic pastoral group that will support the growth of the early state and grow along beside them. So let's start mapping. As mentioned before, we will be considering the primary and early states that formed in our fictional worlds during the Antiquity or Classical era, the equivalent time frame of about maybe 3000 BCE to 450 CE on Earth, creating a map that will sort of represent the end of this time period. So as our timeline and state building progresses, we can assume a similar climate change to Earth where the sea levels were reduced and the water volume flowing through streams and coming down in rains was decreased. This sort of climate change would force the rising populations to gather around available water sources, forcing them to lean harder into agricultural efforts and thus their coercive efforts, building states. By around 450 CE, which will be the rough time of our map, any areas of our human migration map previously marked as anything other than possibly very distant or no migration will be mapped here. States, even primary states, could have formed in these areas after the eras we are currently looking at, which we will do in later stages. you can see I have a map here that I started with basically a rough map of world rivers that I then added on some of the early states that were in existence by 450 CE. And note, I did this by hand by referencing a bunch of graphics I could find online that I didn't have the rights to post here myself, so consider this a doodle that I made. So we will be mapping 4 types of groups on our maps. Not all of your maps will necessarily be fully filled in, like we mentioned already. We will have states, which could be fragmented or transient at the time. We will have trade peoples as a state twin, either seafaring or nomadic herders most likely, partially or totally sedentary non-state groups such as tribes or feudal kingdoms, and mostly migratory non-state groups. And these are the ones that, don't already fill in the trade peoples. So let's start with mapping the states. We will mark our map with areas that meet each state requirement, although please remember you can meet these requirements in different ways, one at a time until we can see the overlapped areas. I just included a map here showing basically the areas that produce 82% of the world's cereals in 2008, so not overly useful, but I thought it was an interesting graphic, so you're welcome. But first, state building crop climates. When determining where to place our early states, we will need an environment with soil rich enough to support large populations in a compact area and an ideal climate for our state building crops. So the 2 main types of soil we're going to be looking at here are loess, which is wind deposited, usually glacially derived, and alluvial, flood deposited soils. You are most likely to find alluvial soils in the floodplains around rivers. These are our river valleys, but you can find them around most rivers, just less area. Deltas, stream terraces, and alluvial fans. For our purposes, the river valley floodplains are the ones we're going to be looking for. So you can see here I just overlaid some markings of alluvial soil over my rivers map. And then loess soils are most likely found along the edges, especially downwind, of ice sheets from the last glacial maximum. It just keeps coming up. Go glaciers. Where sediment from glacial erosion would have remained. I have a link in the blog post that has a map showing where the lowest soils are on Earth compared to the last glacial maximum. It is a really, really good graphic. I suggest you go look at it, but I didn't have the rights to include it here. But here I just marked in real quick my last glacial maximum, and then considering both my elevation maps and my wind maps a little bit, I just kind of marked in areas with lowest soil. So now you can break this rule, okay? But you will typically only see a crop emerging within a single continent or close geographic areas. It would be unlikely to see the same crops evolving on opposite sides of the world in antiquity. We are going to map the possible areas first, so for grain crops in general, and then come back and map the specific crops. Rice will most likely evolve in a more tropical region, while the others could be any regions with sufficient climates for grains. If you have fewer state-building crops than continents or connected continental areas, choose another crop that would have grown in each remaining continent or region and have it evolve to fit as many of the state-building requirements as possible. It may be less efficient depending on what you're starting with. If you have more crops than continents, you can have multiple crops cropping up in different parts of the same continent or even in the same region. And again, you can go crazy here as long as you are considering the reasons why certain crops became state-building crops. You can make all sorts of things happen. You can also find other types of taxation methods. This is a place where magical systems in particular might come in handy. So just take the time to think about this and think about what you really want, but we're going to be moving forward with a mostly earth-type replica here. So climates where you can grow the major grains, rice, wheat, barley, and maize, are the following. So rice, arguably the best grain for state building, will typically be found in tropical or subtropical climates that are hot and humid. The best climate regions are AM, CFA, CWA, DWA, and DWB. Ideally, there should also be suitable water for irrigation in the form of river flow, so if you have one of these regions just in the middle of a really flat plain, maybe not the best spot for it. This means that rice farming is especially good in the foothills around mountains. So you can see here I took one of my climate regions map, I wrote on the side just as a reference for myself the good climate regions and circled them here on my map so that you can get an idea of that. And then grains in general are good in warmer, temperate, Mediterranean, and continental climates, like sea climates, especially CAS, CSB, CWA, and CWB, and DFA, DFB climates. So you can see, again, I did the same thing here. And also, please remember that we are thinking about areas as they were thousands of years ago. There has been climate change. In general, probably assume the world was a little wetter than it is now, since we are building an Earth-like fantasy world and assuming similar types of climate change. You can probably include some steppe/grassland areas in what would have been suitable, especially in river valleys, because again, when we built these climate region maps, we didn't adjust the climate regions for having large flows of rivers going through them, and they would be a lot more suitable in those areas for this. So think Egypt and the Nile, where there would be more water available anyway. So here you can see I just added both of these to my map, and again, we're going to be changing this, but we have basic suitable climates for rice and suitable climates for grain in general. And so the next step for the state building crops that you are considering, I am using Earth's starting grain set of rice, wheat, barley, and maize. Assign one to each region where it would have been sufficiently ideal of an environment to be evolved and cultivated in. And the crop can spread out from there as it makes sense. So you can see here I have on the right rice, wheat, barley, and maize, and I sort of made little stars where I think it would make sense to have these. So you can see for wheat, I sort of had this evolving in that northern continent over here in the west. From there, it easily could be moved down here, and right here, this land is really close, and there is very early migration there, so very early trade routes. It makes complete sense that this wheat would have been brought over into this area up here. And then I have maize evolving on this continent that was mostly only migrated due to land bridges here. So in more recent eras, there's probably in antiquity little or no contact between this continent. Wow, I cannot talk today, I'm sorry. There would have been little to no transfer probably between this continent and the other ones, which is why I only have maize here and none of the other crops here as well. And then I have barley, which I'm assuming would have maybe evolved or, been cultivated down in this area to be a good state building crop, and then brought over to this little island here, which is very, very close by. And then I did not place any in my southern continent because there are no people there yet, so they did not cultivate anything there. When I get to later stages in this, I will have to decide if I want crops to be brought there or new crops to be cultivated. I think it is unlikely for people to show up for the first time and be able to cultivate any native crops in any reasonable amount of time, since I think I have cultivation there be within the last 1,000 years about. So that's not really enough time for how long it takes us to really cultivate crops like in scale. So probably there we will end up just bringing maybe barley down, maybe wheat will make it down. That's sort of a transfer, given that wheat would be accessible through here and through here once there are, people moving in that area. Yep. Okay, so here what I did is I just spread those initial starting points for the evolution of those state building crops out where it made sense. I lost some of the areas that were specifically for rice that I didn't have rice in, so I restricted those a little bit. I didn't put rice in some of the grain-only spots, although you'll notice the place where I have rice up here, I also have wheat moving through, so that was an easy place to kind of still fill in. So, find the areas that will have both suitable soil and climate, and I like to mark the different optimal soils with a pattern, so like stripes or dots, and the climates with rice optimal and other grain optimal colors. Another important note is that these places are starting points for state building grains, but that does not mean that the growing of those crops can't expand out of those areas or that states must be within those areas. And if you have another crop that can be grown productively enough but isn't perhaps great for taxation, you can rely more on corvée labor, but do check what environments those plants would grow in. And if you have developed fantasy crops to sustain a state, take into account the ideal growing conditions. So here you can see the overlap of climate for different crops and the types of soil that is available there. So from there, I marked any of the areas with both a crop and a soil as a potential state building grain area. And a more neat version of that map. So, states also need navigable rivers or coastal waters nearby for communication, control, travel, and trade. So the best land for navigable rivers is going to be a little flatter, so the water is more calm. You also need the rivers that are relatively stable, so river deltas and wetlands are out, although they were already out due to the richness of subsistence options. Flat plains or gently rolling hills aren't the only option here, although they would certainly be great. Also consider plateaus and mountainous valleys. And look at your rivers and elevation map to identify parts of rivers that would meet these conditions. Again, for the most part, you're going to be avoiding areas that are going to be up in the mountains or other sharp decreases in elevation. And then finding coastlines might be obvious. I didn't even map them in here. But there are definitely some that would be more or less conducive to easy navigation. Calmer seas and winds will make navigation much easier. More isolated bodies of water where you won't see fast ocean currents and most winds will have already been slowed by coming over land will likely have calmer waters. And on the opposite end, if you have wind currents or ocean currents that travel unimpeded around the globe, so latitudes with basically no land masses in them, sea travel will probably be incredibly difficult and dangerous. And we've talked about some of these conditions in the weather portion of the world building guide when talking about winds. So the third condition is more likely in areas with some geographic isolation. So this is surrounded by deserts, mountains, oceans, etc. So you could basically just reference the work we did in part 1, cultural divides, where we marked geographic barriers. Most of these are going to be these poor traversal areas that we have marked in gray here. So you're going to be more likely to see these areas pop up in, different regions isolated by those. All right, and I did say before that wetlands are a bad place for states, and they are, but states have the tendency to dry up wetlands to expand farmable land, such as diverting water flow to irrigate their crops, and generally just to state control of the land around them because we're people and that's what we do. So feel free to expand states into wetlands, especially to touch the coast as they would be inclined to do, unless the wetlands are like huge. And don't start them in a wetland. And if you have a wetland that's not on the coast, like a big bog area or something like that, probably avoid that area unless you have a reason not to, right? But once you choose where your states will be, you will need to decide how to satisfy the other needs, such as the history of hardship and sufficiently authoritarian government while world building. We will get into this more later. And you may decide further on that you want to reduce these initial state locations, such as when you're mapping like the Twin States. If you decide, there wouldn't really be good trade opportunities here, maybe you cross some of those states off and go back and rework. That's fine. Or if you end up having too many, that's fine too. So you can see here we have those waterways and the potential for state building grains here on our map. So we can add states to the map. And we have this. And you'll notice I have a lot here compared to what we would have seen on Earth. I thought that would be more fun. Mostly just because I wanted to. You probably would want to reduce it a little bit more than this. Or not. It's up to you. And then more neatly, our states. Moving on to mapping the traders. Everywhere that you have states mapped, you will want to add parallel or twin traders nearby. These are people that are nomadic travelers, likely seafarers, or nomadic herders in areas where there are subsistence options that are likely too low for large-scale settlements, but not exclusively. So nomadic herders would likely be found somewhere there are beasts of burden that can be used as pack animals. We mapped this out in the last part, but you can incorporate some migration of animals and people bringing them to new areas as they move around, and you can make note of that for your history as well. And then in arid or semi-arid regions such as, grassland, steppe, or desert or tundra biomes. So here's a look at our states over our biomes. And here's a look at our animals with some arrows to show where they might have been brought to easily in this period. And we do have those maps of what specific animals these were that were brought around, so that would be pretty relevant for cultural world building and world building in general later, as you consider what types of animals these places were, brought up to utilize. So seafarers would likely be found around less habitable land, such as rocky coasts and islands, areas with good fishing and upwelling, bodies of water that are more enclosed and surrounded by more land, so less likely along open ocean coasts, but you do you. And so if we add in our state twin traders, we get this. And you will see I have one spot here up in the central continent where I have a more seafaring state. The way I built my land masses here, I don't actually have a lot of optimal areas for this. I have nothing that's even similar to like the Mediterranean on this map, which shows a little bit of a lack of landform diversity here, but keep that in mind if you have those areas. So let's map in our non-state, mostly or entirely settled group. So there's a large diversity in societies that can fit into this group. You could see anything from individual tribal villages to large feudal kingdoms. For the most part, these will be areas that have sufficient biodiversity for subsistence groups to remain more settled or have fertile enough land for smaller scale agriculture. So consider the following areas. Areas that fit some of the state requirements, but not all. So here I basically circled all the areas where we didn't put states, but that had one or both of the waterways or state building grain potentials. And then productive areas for aquaculture, so such as wetlands, rainforests, river deltas, coasts, and islands. I went through and circled these here in gold. It's a little bit hard to see, but I think you get the idea. And then the intersectional zones between climatic regions or bioregions. So you can look at your climate or biomes maps. I mainly looked at my biomaps here and basically look at the areas where you have a lot of different ones in a small area, because that would basically mean that nearby there are a lot of different options in terms of the types of animals, the types of crops. You're less likely to experience the same amounts of hardships there as a subsistence group, because remember, more options is better. So you can see, especially like in this area, we had a lot of options. There's a good bit over here. There's a good bit up in this region, down here. Anywhere you see those small clusters of quickly changing bioregions, focus there. And then that gives us these partially settled areas. So finally, our non-state, mostly migratory groups. And these are groups that, they're migratory, so they're likely to have moved around in order to attain enough food resources to sustain themselves. They may be frequently on the move within a large area. They may rotate between a few locations. They may bring their herds around good grazing land. They could follow migratory paths of animals they hunt, or any number of other options. And you are more likely to see them in the following areas. Anywhere with insufficient food sources, or, settlement. Arid or semi-arid regions such as grassland, steppe, desert, or tundra biomes, and mountainous regions. And now you are free to break any of these guidelines as you see fit. Just come up with a justification for how that group is surviving in the given environment. Basically what I did is anywhere that I had people, I just filled it in with migratory groups. Because something important to remember here is that states are going to be the most densely populated, followed by your settled groups, followed by your twins and your migratory populations. So even though I have this entire area marked as green, that does not mean that there would actively be migratory groups moving through that area much, if ever. So just keep that in mind. There's a lot of open space in here. So next you can spend some time cleaning up your map until it makes sense to you and looks the way you want. Break a few conventions, do something weird, document some of the background information for all of these classical states and societies, which we will be using probably 2 parts from now. So in the next few parts of this guide, we will be mapping out another era map, or a few, perhaps covering an equivalent of the early or Middle Ages, and this will focus on building up a history of conflict, expansion, empires, and more. And we will also have another video where we will detail the challenges that different societies would experience due to natural disasters, the environment, political conflict, etc. And we will be sort of breaking this into things that are intrinsic challenges of where they are living and the things that come from the histories that we will be building up as we do this process here. And we will be discussing the ways that societies might adapt to meet these challenges, trying to focus more on this is the problem and here are some examples of how it was solved, but not limiting societies to fitting those sorts of structures. So that is basically it for this part. If you have any questions or thoughts or problems that you run across, please let me know down below. I'm sure we'll be discussing this a lot in the Discord. And yeah, I'm honestly really proud of this one and the direction that this guide is going in now. And yeah, so thank you. Like, comment, subscribe, whatever. See you next time.